myself, and Chris is here taking some notes. We have three folks in the audience. I'll just remind those in the audience and for new folk in the audience as well that we have this jury rig, so he's on the phone. So if at any time you can't hear what Matt is saying or whatever, just let us know and we'll get him a little closer to the mic. Sometimes we get too close and we get the feedback. So, or if you need anything repeated. And we have been fairly interactive, so if you have any great ideas as we're going through, please feel free to bring them up. Okay, first thing we want to do is we sent the minutes out for, I think there were four or five sets. Anybody have any issues with those? If not, we'll get those approved and posted. We did not do the last one yet, so we'll have a couple at next week's meeting, assuming we don't finish Thursday. We'll have whatever that last one, and then probably today's to look at as well. But we got any issues on those? All right, good, thanks. So we'll enter them in. We have not met since we had kind of briefing to the commissioners the other day. So I did want to kind of run through some of the things that we told them and some of the things that we kind of learned as a result of that. First, kind of went through basically on the sewer side, showed them, kind of the workings of the workbook. It was very, very difficult, I think, from their perspective to be able to see all that, on the screen. I guess the takeaway for me was when we get ready to present to them, we've got to really figure out a better way to be able to show them what our recommendation is and what the impacts of each of the different variables are. With them, and it's just very tough to do on a computer screen, looking through pieces of a workbook. So be thinking about how we want to do that. The other thing that kind of came out of it was that they preferred to get both recommendations, water and sewer, at the same time. So once we get through working through the water piece of it, then we'll go formally to them to show them both at the same time and the impacts. Okay, Matt, you want to kind of take us into the water side? Kind of talk about the format of the workbook and such.
Sure. Okay. So the group should be very familiar by now with the setup of the workbooks in general. We've come a long way on the wastewater side since we started. And there are a lot of things in the workbook on the wastewater side. But it seems like everyone is generally comfortable with what's in there. And I'd say that we're very close to being done with that piece. At least, the workbook seems to be in good shape, and everyone seems to be comfortable with what's in there and the methodology that's used to calculate the wastewater rate and the ready-to-serve charge. So because of everyone's comfort level and because of the complexities in the workbook, meaning how it kind of flows together from tab to tab, I thought it made sense to basically leverage the wastewater workbook when creating the water one. So what I did was I created a water one based on the wastewater one and then had to retrofit it, for lack of a better term, to have all the water pieces in there rather than the wastewater pieces. So that took a little bit of an effort to get there, but it's in good shape now. Some people on the phone have seen a prior version of the water workbook. This one I've completed what I wanted to do for that first pass through water to get it fully populated with the water data, get the bills being calculated correctly. The one thing that hasn't been done yet on the water side is that real detail tab at the very back of the workbook that calculates all the different accounts with all the different options, and calculates the number of bills on the water side. That's the only piece that hasn't been done. So that bar graph, the detailed bar graph with the user groups one, is still not accurate on the water side. So that's on my to-do list to get that done. But otherwise, everything in here is up to date and ready to be presented. But it's still very much a first pass. And there are definitely going to be conversations that take place on the water side for what the rate structure should look like. Because it may not be as straightforward as the water one, as the wastewater one. Just on the surface, it's not, because on the wastewater side, we were calculating a rate for the in-city users, for the Rehoboth Beach users, whereas on the water side, there are the Rehoboth Beach users, but there are also the out-of-town users, and there are also the Breezewood users, which are billed.
And Matt, could I just
today.
interject, and I just want to bring everybody up to speed or remind them of the different rates. So on the water side, we do an in-town peak rate and an in-town non-peak rate. So it differs by the month of the year. We have an out-of-town peak rate and an out-of-town non-peak rate, and that's equal to twice our in-town rate. So it's just multiply it times 2. And again, I'm just speaking to the 1-inch meters. There's a corresponding increase to the other size meters as well. But we'll just kind of keep it consistent with just talking to the 1-inch meters. Breezewood is 1.5 times our in-town rates for both peak and non-peak. And North Shores, I think North Shores is also at two times. So that's why there was so many different categories of costs associated with the water side. So that gives a little background as to what Matt was just talking about.
Exactly.
There was also a strange one. There's a completely different one for the YMCA. I'm not quite sure how we got to that particular number, but it's different than all the others. And it's on that table that we handed out a meeting or two ago. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. So the wastewater side is not, the way that these different areas are built for their usage, for their flow, is different than what Kevin just presented. So on the wastewater side, we were just focused on that one rate for the in-city users. But now on the water side, we have to also consider what rate we're going to look at for the Breezewood users, for the out-of-city users, which currently are billed at twice the in-city rate, as Kevin just mentioned a moment ago. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we talk today. And I'm sure it'll come up. I'm sure we'll talk about it in the very near future. But the workbook currently, as it's designed, is still targeting that in-city rate only. So at some point, we have to think about and get in here how we're going to do those the rates for the other areas, because we'll have to make sure that we're accounting for it properly in the workbook. Currently, we're still targeting just an in-city rate.
I just have a quick question there. This group it's in our purview to recommend rates for those other out of town because they're not governed by some other agreement that is beyond our scope.
Say that again. We are going to
I'll
develop our
turn it
rate
into
for
a
that.
positive instead of a
Right.
negative. Is there any impediment to changing the rates on those other groups? Or is that totally at the ability of the city at any point to do?
I think it's within our purview to do, and we can do.
Correct.
Right.
Okay.
And plan to do.
It's not governed by some other agreement?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, Matt, I'm finished.
Uh-oh. Did we lose you?
Oh, I'm here.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is it my turn again?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. And then also another thing to keep in mind is whether the city wants to continue to go with just the flat rate. Because there have been some discussions on maybe changing that too to a tiered rate structure as well. Another thing to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this right now, this is set up the same way as wastewater, which means it's targeting just that one rate rather than a rate across multiple tiers. walk you through where we are with this. It is, I already said, up exactly like wastewater. So you'll see a lot of the same stuff that you've already become used to, or somewhat used to on the wastewater side. So the first tab is that cost allocation tab. We're aimed at getting at the fixed and non-fixed ratios. Same exact setup. What we did was we pulled in here the wastewater operating budget, so the different accounts. There's the account string on the left, and then the different account names on the right. This is all water, so some of the accounts are different. Some of the account names are different than what we saw in wastewater, but generally the same. They lined up pretty well. The reason why those lines are in red there, and you can see too clearly here, part-time salaries and other salaries, is because the first pass as we went through this, when we first started working on these different allocations, that's Kevin Burt and I worked off of the I believe it was the FY19 operating budget. And then when I asked Burt to send me account numbers so that I could fill in the account numbers on this tab and on another tab, the FY20 budget, and there were additional line items in there for the FY20 budget. I just wanted to identify which ones were in FY20 because we didn't work on those when we did the FY19 piece. It's really a minor element, but I just wanted to point out why we have those in red. They don't impact the calculations that are done because our initial projections for costs do not include line items because we based it off of FY19, not off FY20. So that's just FYI, and there is a description down here just to explain why those are in red. But otherwise, this is the exact same setup, and a lot of the percentages that we used for wastewater, we also used for water. Down here at the bottom is the capital, debt, and other costs. And other costs are really just additional operating costs that he had identified in their table that they provided, their investment table. And then also indirect costs as well are included here. But whereas with wastewater, there was a discussion that took place in those larger projects as to what would be fixed versus non-fixed, and Kevin worked with them on that, and they came back with certain percentages for the outfall project, and also for the wastewater treatment plant upgrade, all the different phases. And there was a certain amount of non-fixed costs that needed to be included for those. The percentages for those on wastewater were not 100% fixed. There was a certain ratio, I don't remember off the top of my head what they were, but we got that information from GHD and we included it on the wastewater. Here on the water side, I believe we're not going to be consulting that with GHD because there wouldn't be anything that would be designated as non-fixed on the water side. So we're carrying those at 100% fixed in these allocations. Any questions or comments?
Not here. Yeah.
Okay. Here's the administrative cost tab. It's set up very similarly. You may recall that when we worked on wastewater at the very tail end of our wastewater discussion, when the ready-to surcharge came into play, we wanted to focus on recovering certain costs with that charge. So it could be cost-based and rather than just an arbitrary number. And we decided to focus on administrative costs. So we put this tab in place in the wastewater workbook. And the design was really to identify what the percentage of the different line items in the budget were administrative and which were non-administrative. So we're doing the same thing here for water. And this was work that, again, that Kevin Burt and I did on the side recently to get comfortable with these percentages. We did leverage wastewater where we could. So if you were to compare the two, you'd see that they line up pretty well for the line items that appeared in both budgets. There were other line items that didn't appear in both budgets, and we need to work on those. But like with wastewater, the same exact methodology. And then down here at the bottom, we have 0% for all the capital and the extra operating, and 100% for non-admin for everything but indirect costs. And our first pass ended up being down here for FY20, which is this number in yellow, about $15.56 per bill. So that might be your ready to serve charge. The reason why I say might is because that number in red is just a guesstimate on the number of bills in place on the water side, based on the number of accounts and based on what we came up with for wastewater. Basically almost double the amount of bills that we have on the wastewater. Now, I'm going to spend some time to get a little bit more comfortable with that number, but I believe it's going to be somewhere near 20,000. So that's what I'm including for now. But once I'm comfortable with that number, I will include it here. But of course, once that number updates to whatever number I come up with, 1556 will change. And that 1556 is just an FY20 number. Based on the FY20 projected cost, that number will be different, and I'll show you in a moment, as you go out multiple years, because there are different costs each year. That's just our first pass of what we're showing for FY20. Okay. Rate setting objectives tab, you're probably somewhat used to this by now. As a reminder, we had some of these configurable things, some of these decision points, and some of those busier tabs that are later on in the workbook. We wanted to take them out of those busier tabs and move them to the front so that decisions, whatever important decisions we thought needed to be made, could be made on one tab, and then those decisions, based on those decisions, the numbers would update throughout the workbook. This is set up very similarly to wastewater. The only real difference is that there's no sewer surcharge area. You may recall on the wastewater side that we had an area for sewer surcharge reserves, and whether we wanted to leverage some funds in those reserves to provide rate relief, basically to lower the rate that was being calculated. And we were doing that on the wastewater side. Right now we have it as $250,000 per year starting in FY20 and ending in FY25. We don't have that luxury on the water side because there is no reserve that is similar to that, at least not one that I'm aware of. So simply we just hit it because there's no reason to look at it on the water side. So it's hidden here, otherwise everything is the same. You'll see the ready to serve area, include it yes or no. Right now we have it set to yes. Based on administrative costs, yes, we have that set to yes. Could be set to no if you'd rather type in your own amount in this cell, but for now we're including it as yes. And that's why this cell here is 0, because we're not setting it. We're going to leverage the administrative costs that are calculated. Recover which costs, basically for the ready to serve charge, what kind of costs are we putting them up against, or which costs are we recovering? You may recall it's either fixed, non-fixed, or total. On the wastewater side, we did this as fixed, but if you wanted to change it, you could do it here. And then this number is simply a calculation based on what the projected yearly revenue is, and that's really just, I believe, an FY20 number for now. But that gives you a sense of what you're looking at on a yearly basis. Minimum charge, we have it set to no as we do on the wastewater side currently, because we don't believe there's a need to do both the ready charge. But if you were interested in seeing what that would look like, you can set it here. And then, moment. Flow totals for rates. This is something that we've talked about for a very long time, and ever since the beginning of our conversations, we've always been focused on using total flow to calculate the rate for fixed costs, and using peak flow to calculate the rate for non-fixed costs. So that's what we have here. And then down below that, our whatever projected surplus we have in a given year, should we use that to as quote unquote rate relief in the following year or in a following year, so that the rate that gets calculated is a little bit lower than it would be if you weren't using the surplus. And currently we have it set to yes based on some of the conversations we've had in the past, but we could set that to no if we wanted to.
And Kevin, can I just interject two things here? I think it's going to be important for people to understand as we attempt to explain what the proposal is, that people understand. I think it's, can you scroll down, back down again a little bit, Matt? I think, yeah, it was there at the bottom. I wasn't sure that was all of it. The flow totals for rates lines 22 and 23, the reasoning behind setting those, because I think that gets at concerns about, well, gee, if you're coming up with just one rate or whatever we come up with, that it's the fixed costs are based on the total flow and the non-fixed costs are based on peak. People have questions about, well, why aren't you basing things on peak? And I think it's going to be important that people understand how that decision point works in there. And the other question that I had was up in line 10, where it's things for the recovering the administrative costs are based on FY20 figures, and that was talking about getting the number of bills to refine that. And it recalled our discussion on the wastewater side, that we were working originally off of like 17 or 18, FY17 or 18 numbers. Are the two sides going to end up being in alignment in terms of what they're based on in terms of the fiscal year? Because it seems like we're kind of getting into FY20 here, and a lot of the discussion on the wastewater was based on earlier figures.
So, Matt, do you know on the wastewater side, the number of bills, what data was that based on?
It's still the same data set that I've been using all along. It's that October 2016 to September 2017 data set. Right.
And then now we're talking about for the number of bills, we're going to use 2020 or FY20.
Well,
it's the same. No, we're using the same data for that number of bills calculation, right?
We're using the same.
I was planning on using the same data because that's the only billing data I have available to me at the moment.
Okay, so we're not out of phase between the two sides.
It shouldn't be. Yeah. And I think the number you've grabbed, Matt, is going to be pretty close. I mean, if we're 5,500 or so accounts, and most of them are billed quarterly, so times 4 would be 20 grand.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we weren't out of phase on those two sides, and if we were, if we could kind of get into phase.
Okay, I think we're okay.
Okay. Thanks.
I heard the ad machine.
Okay.
Yep.
Should I keep moving along?
Yeah, please.
Is that a yes? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So the next tab, it is pretty busy looking at this point, but this is where we do the leveling off of the different rates and the ready to serve by option. So I'll just walk you through this. So makes a little more sense because obviously it's pretty busy at the moment. So you have your years going across the top over here. You have your calculated rates based on just trying to recover those costs in that given year. And you can see as you go left to right that the rate is different. So this is the variable line as we've been calling it. Basically what the rates might look like if you decide to hit that moving target each year. Same with the rate of serve, exact same thing. It changes going left to right. Okay? And generally with water, as you kind of go left to right here, you see that there's not a whole lot of movement in rates. At least it kind of peaks in this area right here. And this is actually, I should mention this, that this is based on some work that Kevin, some data that Kevin provided very recently. He took a look at GHD's table as they provided to us months back when we first started working on this, and made some modifications to it based on new information that he had available. And what that meant was that the first pass that we had in the water workbook had large expenditures in the outlying years, meaning the very end of this 12-year period that we're looking at. And those aren't in the latest version that we have. I mean, there are expenditures there. It's just not as large. But we see now that the largest expenditures are now in the next few years, although compared to wastewater and how much that jumps up, it's not nearly as big a jump. I think the best way to show it so that you get a sense of what we're dealing with at expenditures high level is to go here and take a look at that graph that I have right here. This shows you the total expenditures by year over the 12-year period. This is year one, so this is FY20 down here, $2.7 million. Year two, 3.2. Year three is the highest at 4.2. So we go from 2.7 to 4.2 over a 2-year period, and then it starts going back down again. And then we're at 3.5 in year 5, and that's basically where you're at the rest of the way. And these projections do include an inflation factor. We're increasing expenses every year, at least the regular budgeted expenses in the operating budget. The difference here is that it's the capital stuff that's really driving it. The initial years is pretty high, and then as you can see, it kind of falls off a little bit. There's still capital expenditures, it's just that they're not as big as they are in the next few years.
So Matt, just one thought. I think this, while this, unlike sewer, would not lead us to necessarily have to go to a kind of a rate smoothing kind of idea where we want to lock in a rate at 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 years. But I do think it probably makes sense to tie it over the same period that we were looking at sewer, just for consistency in the billings and those kind of things. Not as obvious as we were in the sewer, where it really helps us kind of mitigate some of those spikes. But here it may still be worth considering to do a set rate for whatever we agreed to on the sewer side, which I think right now we've kind of set off a 4-year kind of lock in. For the rates, we review them at the 3-year mark, see if we want to make any adjustments based upon what we're able to bring in and costs associated with that period of time. But not nearly as critical on the water side, just from a rate smoothing perspective.
Right, and again, those capital expenditures that are proposed there, I mean, that did take into account future. So it's not like we're potentially looking at 6 years from now another capital
Correct.
expense.
Right. We don't have a new water tank,
Right.
kind of in the plan to build in 6 years out or so.
And this kind of smoothed out and brought back what I think this graph looked like before, which was the big bump at the
Had a
end.
huge bump at the
Right.
end, right. Well, when we dug into the asset management report, we could not figure out what those costs were tied to. I mean, it wasn't referenced in the report other than in a graph. So we had pulled that and put it in. So I have a due out with GHD, who prepared the asset management report several years ago. But we just put it back to kind of coincide with what kind of the cycle of costs were. But it really knocked that peak out, then makes everything level. The other thing we did as a result of looking at the asset management report as it existed in the first cut on the table was there was a couple of things in there that were missing. that we've come to learn, since that asset management report. Things like, a meter replacement program, which we've kind of stepped up to do. First iteration is in this year's budget. And that's a significant number. I think it's 400,000 this year's budget. I think 4 or 5 in each of the subsequent, kind of as the plan program looks. And then the other one was I think the filter media replacement, where we have to replace the activated charcoal at the water treatment facility, which was not in the program, and that's a significant number. It's 140 or 50,000 every 5 years. So,
yeah, but it's on the screen.
okay, so those were the adds that from what folks had seen in the prior graph. That's kind of the 3 changes we made to that profile.
So for the next 3 years, to the best of your knowledge, we've got most of the essential improvements that are needed, that heretofore some real gaps, but now it looks, you can't be 100% sure, but now
Right.
it's more contained now than it was previously.
Yes, I think so. And we had some holes that we knew of from the asset management report to the current budget,
Right.
that we wanted to make sure we captured in here. So unless they come back and say, no, in year 2032, that we had to do X, and that's why it was, I think it was a couple million out there in each one. It wasn't, so we couldn't really figure it out logically what it was, because it wasn't enough to build a new tank, so it wasn't new tank construction, but it was way more than, a typical programmatic upgrade rehab kind of thing was. So we've asked them, we'll see what they say.
And even if they came back and they said
Yeah, but I have those amounts highlighted on the screen in yellow right now, just so you can take a look
great.
at it.
So one was 800, one was 700,000. So it just didn't track.
right, but even if that were the case, let's assume something that nobody thought of, that they came up with something and it was a number of that size or larger, that wouldn't really impact if we're looking at things that are in the 1, 2, 3 year time frame.
Correct.
It'd be irrespective. So if time marches on, and at the end of 2 or 3 years, that comes up or manifests itself, then it can be dealt with then, saying, okay, now that we know that, should we incorporate a bit each year so it doesn't become a hard hit, or do we let it hang out there for a few more years due to reasons that I don't know what they might be at that point in time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree wholeheartedly. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Yep. And another thing that's worth pointing out, and maybe we've talked about this in the past, I know I have with some people, is in terms of financing the capital, just moving that out of the way. On the wastewater side, we talked about using up the SRF financing available to the city to pay for some of the outfalls included, and then some of the treatment plant upgrade phases. And then the rest would be considered capital outlay, meaning that they wouldn't be funded via borrowing. On the water side, we are assuming outlay for all of the capital pieces that we were just looking at in that other table. The only borrowing that is in our analysis is the one that's already on the books for the Lynch principal and interest, which you can see on row 35 there. Excuse me, on the screen. And then 2 rows below that are the total cost that we're considering outlay for capital from GHC's plan. The row 37 here represents the capital in GHC's plan. Row 35 is existing principal and interest. And then also, just to make everyone aware, row 34 here is also expenses identified in GHC's plan. We're calling them operating here because they're more O&M than they are capital. However, they have the same impact on the bottom line. Here it's the outlay line because there are no borrowings involved. We still separate them as operating versus capital in case at some point borrowings are considered to be in play, then we would make that adjustment, but I wanted to point that out. The row 34 and row 37 are the total expenses coming from GHC's plan if you add them together. Row 35 is principal and interest already on the book. And you can see that comes off the book in FY29. Right here would be the first year that you don't have that payment.
by having those lines in there, that essentially says that under normal operations and effective management, that represents for those which are capital intensive investments, provides an outside boundary for this budget. As each year goes by, I'm assuming what'll happen is Kevin or the management within the entire organization will assess things and say, okay, we plan to do that in 2021, but it really looks a little premature. We're gonna do it in 2023. So there's management discretion within that number, but it provides a good boundary condition that says it's not being underestimated, but it's being legitimately assessed as best you can when you're doing it at year 0 and you're covering a much longer time frame. Okay.
Okay, Matt?
Okay. All right, so no further questions on the expenses, it seems like for now, but all the data is available on the workbook. If there are questions, we can always go back. So we were here. We got sidetracked, but I wanted to show you how the expenses, how the graph was showing the expenses over these years. So you can kind of tell, based on if you just follow the rates from left to right here, how it goes from 5.22, 6.39, 9.11, which is coinciding with that peak year, and then how it goes downward from there. And then once you get down in the 7 range, you're pretty much in the 7 range the rest of the way, although it goes back down to just below 7. And the ready to serve follows a similar path, which obviously makes sense. Actually, look at that. Well, it would be based on the percentage of administrative costs there. So capital doesn't have an impact on administrative costs, so I guess that does make sense. That it falls a little bit of a different trajectory. Okay. So down below that, you'll see the different leveling options that we presented. And they're the same exact options on the wastewater side. Whereas option 1 is the 2-year period, and I've identified the 2-year where they're the same in the same colors, just so to make it a little bit easier to follow. Where on the 2-year, you go 2 years of yellow, 2 years of orange, 2 years of yellow, etc. On the 3-year, you got 3 years of yellow, 3 years of orange, and then on the 4-year, 4 and 4, and then the 6-year, 6 and 6. And you can see that leveling out in each case. And then so this is now we're on the different rate impact tabs, and this is where if you wanted to look at it at a high level, at the different options using a high level, we have some graphs here for you. There are, as you know, very detailed tabs later in the workbook that if you just look at the numbers there, it's kind of hard to comprehend exactly what it's trying to tell you. There's just too many numbers. So we've spent time over the past few weeks to try and come up with a better way to present that data, and we've come up with graphs for that purpose. And I think generally the people I've shown this to have been satisfied with it. So we've kept them in here. I can walk you through each graph, just so that you're aware of what's in here, although I think probably most of you have seen these before. The first graph, actually, let me show you the second one first. So the second one first is revenue projections versus revenue requirement, which is the cost to recover via rates. So you may recall when we have those on those detailed tabs, we start with the total cost, we back out revenue that the city can expect from everything other than rates and the ready-to-serve charge, if that's included, so that we can target just what that revenue requirement is for the rate and for the ready-to-serve, basically ignoring everything else. And this graph represents that piece. The blue line is the revenue requirement, what we're targeting to recover, and the orange line, or I guess it's a little reddish line, is what we're projecting for revenue from the rates in the ready to serve. And you also may recall that because I have on each of those other tabs, I have this reconciliation area, and it shows that there's a projected surplus for each of the years, which is shown here on the graph as well, how the orange is a little bit above the blue.
Are each one of these
Now-
I can't see the
Yes.
bottom of this graph.
Yes.
So is 2020 here, or is this 20?
If that was for me, I can't hear.
Yeah,
what the
just,
question was. Sorry.
it was looking at the bottom, or the, that,
Scroll down a little.
yeah, the x-axis on the chart, if that was years. So yeah, just roll down a line or two so you can see the bottom.
That's kind of hard to do.
Yeah, so started at 2020 and then goes out through 2031.
Yeah, all the data that's being presented is over that same 12-month period, 12-year period. Starting with now, well, it's now the current fiscal year, but starting with FY20 all the way out through 31. And as a reminder, the reason why we're focused on that time period is because that is the time period that GHD presented in that table that they provided for both water and wastewater. So we decided to have our financial projections cover that same time period. So I thought it made sense to include a little bit of a different graph that's similar. Because if you go down here, that blue line does not represent all the costs. It just represents what we're calling the revenue requirement, what we're targeting to recover via rates and ready to serve. But we do have those other factors in play, how we're backing out the non-rates revenue. And at least on the wastewater side, we also have some reserves that we're using, the sewer surcharge reserves. And now we're also using the surplus too. If we were to set on the rate objectives tab, if we were to set to use the surplus in a subsequent year, then that is also lowering what we're trying to recover via rate. So this graph kind of ties it all together. So this is total everything. Total costs and how are we recovering those costs.
And then
The blue line represents.
I was just saying, could you describe, because we really can't see the legend or the inset, what the various colors in each of the graphs or each of the
Yep.
years covers? Like you got the orange is,
Non-rates
Yep.
revenue.
yeah.
So this, I just made it a little bit smaller. I know my Excel isn't very, we can't see a whole lot with the way that it's showing up on my laptop right now.
Right.
The blue line represents your total cost. The bottom part of the bar, this orangey color, represents your non-rates revenue, so the stuff that's being backed out at the beginning. So that would be things like connection fees, penalty and interest. I'd have to look at that other analysis, but basically any revenue line item that is not rates from the in-city, out-of-city, and in-city and out-of-city users. Exactly, that's what it is. We're not including, we're also backing out the Dewey Beach one. That's a separate conversation that we'll have to have at some point. Because that, I don't believe our charge here is to also set the Dewey rate. I think that's also something that's done on the side. So I guess that's something worth discussing at some point, but we are backing that out as well in this this RNG section. Then right above that is the blue is the ready to serve, and the green is your rate, your projected revenue from rates. This little yellow area, very small, represents that surplus that that in each year, the green does go past the blue. Just like how down below we're showing a surplus, it shows it as well. Now this is the graph, this bar graph here needs to be updated. This is the data set that needs to be updated. This still represents some wastewater data that hasn't been updated yet. So we're gonna ignore that for now, but this is the user groups bar graph that does have value on the wastewater side, it's accurate. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to show how many users fall into a certain group for each fiscal year based on the rates and the ready to serve that we're projecting for that year. That will be updated shortly once I get that other data set found. This is accurate. These graphs show your those 8 example users that we've been focused on from the very beginning, and we have a specific account number in here too that you could reference if you wanted to. The blue line for them represents the current charges, and that's just assuming that they would pay the same all the way through the same 12 years, all the way through the 12. The orange represents an updated bill based on what we've calculated as rates and ready to serve in a given year. The first 4 examples, which are the ones that you still see on your screen, are users with 1-inch meters. So they have a smaller quarterly charge today. They have the smallest one today. When we get down to here, this user here, example 5, has a 1.5-inch meter. So their yearly amount is a little bit higher for that reason, because it's a really small user. So if you were to compare that to example 1, which is also a small user, you'll see that the charges are a little bit higher today in today's bill, with today's bill. This is a 2-inch user here. That's a 3-inch user. And this is your largest, a very heavy user. This last graph shows a very heavy user that pays just under $20,000 today. This is a yearly basis. But, so in year 3, now keep in mind this is a variable. This is without the rates being leveled out. That's why everything's jumping from year to year on the orange line here. But for FY22, which is that peak period, just under $19,000 is what they pay based on the current bill structure. And we're projecting them to have a bill of $58,000 in that year. It's a pretty big jump. And just because I like to show it, not that this is being considered at this point, if you were to take the ready to serve out of the equation, just set it to no, you're not going to see much of a difference on the larger users, but on the smaller users, you're going to see that their bill actually would go down. Because they pay a quarterly charge now, although granted it's not an extremely large one, but they do. And this orange represents flow only. There's no fixed charge, ready to serve charge. If you were to set that to no. And example 1, same thing, which is a very small user. Not that the city's considering it, but if you were to take out that ready to serve, I just want to show you what the impact might be.
So that impact was only on a very small user.
Because the current
What's that?
service, because the current service charge is so minimal.
So here's option 1. And a request of some people I spoke to last week, I've actually added a little bit more in these tabs. Kevin, hopefully this satisfies what you were talking about. I kept the option number, but I also added time period to each of these tabs so you know what you're looking at. You know, it says 2-year down here,
Yep,
and the next one says 3-year.
yep.
So this is the 2-year option. It's hard to tell on that one, on example 1. Let's find a more substantial one. We'll go to example 4. But there's now, this is your leveling out. So over the 2-year period, you see that their projected bills are the same. And then it jumps up for the next 2-year period. And then it jumps back down again. And as shown with the expenses, once you get past that peak, everything's pretty level at that point. You don't see a whole lot of variation as you get to the outlying years. It's really just that peak. And for option 3, you see it even more level. There is a peak, but it's really leveled out compared to option 2.
Go to small residential user with 1-inch meter.
Matt, request to go to a small residential user with a 1-inch meter.
Well, example 1 is an extremely small.
Right.
Someone that uses 4,000 gallons a year. Would you like to see that small or a little bit bigger than that?
We're sure cut off. I know where you're cut off.
You want to do a realistic 1-inch user?
Do a
Go.
30,000 gallon a year.
How many?
What do you?
30 or 30. Yeah, go to like example 2 or 3.
What do you call them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then go to large residential user with 1-inch so we can see.
And that'd be number 4, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
So for this large one, what we have, this is option 3. This is a 4-year leveling. We have them paying $339 per year today. Goes up to $786 in the first few years.
And what's,
Basically the whole way.
what's the volume on example 4? Was that 80?
I'm sorry?
What's the volume usage on 80 on example 4? Was it 80,000 gallons? $100,000. Okay.
Which is substantial.
Example 3 is 40,000. Example 2 is 20,000.
Okay. So 4, 20, 40, and 100.
Typical.
So it's a very large residential user. 100,000 is very large.
For typical residential,
In my opinion, it's very large.
3 people, typical use, whether it's here or any place
Call this
else.
one medium. This is your 40,000 per year.
Median.
Hold on, Matt,
More or
there's a
less.
sidebar here.
So the other thing is sometimes we stretch the definition of residential because we're calling the 1-inch meters residential, but we all know that we have a significant number of
That are
our
commercial.
businesses, commercials are off of 1-inch meters. So
And there's some other ways to address that as we get into it.
correct. So really, probably the 3 or 4 bedroom home with 2 or 3 people in it is the
Right.
option, example 3 person. Yeah, those numbers might look real familiar. Okay, thanks, Matt.
And that's really the extent of what I feel like I need to show you today. I can definitely show other things if that's what the group wanted, but that's the extent of the flow of the first 3 tabs. Very similar to wastewater. Get some graphs to look at. There are all these numbers in there if you really want to look at those too.
So what I would like to do is if for Will and the group here, we can either kind of hash them out amongst ourselves today and decide how we want to proceed, or take it away and think about it and come back and kind of pick things on Thursday, whichever the group would like to do. But a couple of things we want to try to agree on. One is our philosophy that we use on wastewater for the ready to serve. Is that something we want to do, to be consistent with on the water side and go after those administrative costs associated with the water program? Does that make sense to the group?
Yes.
Yes?
I think it does, just for clarity across the board for anyone looking
Okay,
at.
great. So we can go and proceed with that philosophy. Philosophically, do we like one rate, or do we like a peak rate and a non-peak rate for water? Right now, we have a peak and a non-peak.
I mean, I think, again, that falls in line with what we've done on the wastewater side.
No, wastewater, we just have
Rate.
one rate.
But it's based on flow.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly right.
I think we keep it the same.
Keep it the same, so we're looking at coming up with a one rate that we would apply both summer and winter.
And
And that,
I tend to want to go there to be consistent, but I want to understand why, what somebody could make as an argument why it should be peak and non-peak. Especially, why that is that way for water.
Well,
Or put it another way, have we addressed potential issues with peak and non-peak with our method that we're coming up with? I
Sharon,
think-
why are you feeling the need to keep it the same?
not-
for consistency,
Are you
What
saying
does-
keep it the same as it is now?
yes.
Or keep it the same as we did with wastewater?
Keep it the same as we have been doing it for a long time.
Okay, well, a peak and a non-peak?
Yes.
But what does that buy us? I mean, we're looking at this with kind of a clean sheet, right? So have we proven yet that there's a benefit to a peak and a non-peak versus just one rate? I mean, there's confusion from, let's say there's confusion potentially from a user, a resident, on why the rates are different. So there's, the onus on the city to make sure that we explain what the difference is, right? But, and I'm not saying I'm for one or the other, I want to understand why you, first out, want to say keep it the same.
So, Matt, what would be the, and I'll answer that, but.
Darn right you will.
Matt, what are the consequences, if any, that you would see in going through this as we currently have it?
Yeah, or
What
maybe,
would be
yeah, maybe said a
What do you
different way,
think?
Matt, I have been awake, I promise, but, in what you've just walked through for us, what could we look at that would show if we did it peak, or one rate versus peak and non-peak, what the impacts would be to a resident? Because I think.
To a year-round resident?
To a year, yeah, so, maybe I shouldn't say to a resident. I should say to a user, or, the person who's paying the bill, I guess is how I should phrase that.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at. So, any downside of that, Matt?
any downside?
And I say that to go through the exercise for what would those two rates be for a property owner who lives here year-round, to show them, what they're paying currently, peak and non-peak, and what they would be paying in the future, peak and non-peak. I just think it's a fairer way to proceed that way, because they've been seeing that difference.
Right.
So do you see any downside in doing that?
Do I see a downside to presenting a peak and off-peak
Yes,
look at things?
yes.
No, just we haven't been focused on that yet. I mean, we've been focused on it in a certain way, but we've never presented the rate as peak and non-peak.
You're a little garbled there at the end. Matt?
Well,
Let me show you what I mean by that.
okay.
Right here, this is the water side. This is not wastewater, but wastewater billed year round, no matter what time period you're looking at, no matter if you have a user that's there all year or if you have a seasonal user. Same rate all the way through. But the defense of peak versus non-peak coming in that we identified what costs we thought the city incurred because it has a peak period. So these are costs above and beyond just normal operation. And we're applying peak flow to that, basically saying that peak flow is tied to those extra costs. So in a way, you have gotten at a peak number. It's just that we're not presenting it as peak versus non-peak here. We're just presenting it as total. So all the calculations that we've done from this point forward and all that user impact stuff is based on that one rate versus the two different rates.
So if I were, Matt, if I were to try and say it in different words, I think what I'm hearing you say is the one rate that we're showing here takes into account essentially peak and non-peak costs, but we've split it out so that we understand where the non-fixed or the peak numbers that are the peak numbers that are causing additional costs, but we factored that into this one rate. So
Yeah, I think that's fair.
okay. So
So this area right here represents basically the year-round operation.
but it does take into a peak cost. It takes into the peak costs.
That's what this represents.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the aggregated costs are there.
But this additional cost above and beyond
Right.
what would be necessary to run the system year-round if you didn't have that seasonal period.
Correct.
And that goes back to my,
That's what this is.
that goes back to my early comment, that explanation of the fixed, non-fixed, peak, total calculation, explanation for why those are what they are and how they get included is the most important thing for people to understand this.
Jay, you had a question?
If you remove,
Nice and loud, so Max.
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
this one's not open, is that
I don't
right?
know. It probably is, yeah.
Can I try it?
Yeah, sure.
Probably have to turn it on.
Anyway.
Dang, you're an engineer.
Yeah, just, right, just yell into the.
The mic is right here.
Use this one.
Can I use?
Yeah,
can I
sure.
use-
Can you hear Matt?
No, those aren't on, these are.
I'm not
I'll speak
hearing
into this.
the other conversation
Gosh,
going
this
on.
makes me feel like a big person.
Excuse me.
Matt, this is Jay.
Jay LeGray,
Concerned
a
citizen.
concerned
Concerned
citizen,
citizen.
part-time resident, and a New England Patriots fan.
Oh.
No,
Oh.
this is punishment.
Okay.
I'm a
We went through this yesterday.
I'm
I
a
just
cowboy
wanted to
fan,
hear
and I don't want anybody to.
Oh, okay.
There's a perception among the homeowners in this town that the commercial users, the big users, use a much higher percentage of their total yearly flow during the summer months, during the peak season. And that if you take away that peak rate, you are giving the big commercial users a birthday present early.
Well, I think our philosophy from day one was we wanted to base everything on flow. If you use more, you pay more.
Exactly.
Not that it cost us any more to make your gallon of water than it cost to make Grotto's gallon of water. So we were really just trying to base it on usage.
I understand that. I'm just telling you what the perception is in the community, and you're gonna have to answer that on Saturday, probably.
But
But you'll be ready to do that, so that'll be fine.
yes,
But while you're here at the table,
Right.
what we've done though here, and what we're showing, is that we have taken into account that, what we're calling here non-fixed, which is that increase in flow that happens during peak seasons. So
I understand that.
this $5.67 takes that into account. So if you use 10 gallons versus business A uses 1,000 gallons, they're gonna be paying more because they're using more water based on that $5.67.
That is totally understood.
Okay, what I'm hearing though is we have the responsibility of making sure that's communicated to people
That's-
so that they
yes.
understand that we're still billing more on usage.
Yes, and
Okay.
you'll be ready to explain that, because there are people with calculators out there
Absolutely,
who don't believe that.
okay.
So
That's
you
fair.
can do it.
There's, and even though you are a Cowboys fan and I'll talk to you anyway because I'm a Giant fan. Anyway, the other part of this though, to your point exactly, which is very important, is the fact that the reason we did this on aggregated flow was to make sure we got everything in there, if you will, the kitchen sink completely. And this concept of peak, non-peak, and we've looked at stuff in other cities, municipalities around the country. In areas such as us, there's a dramatic change between peak and non-peak. And if you go into other places that are more residential and more normal, that don't have a seasonal peak like we do, there is in fact a peak during the summer, but it's about 20 to 40% based on the stats. Ours is 300 to 400%. And the way you can approach that, which we have not done yet, but in order to do that, you have to create the baseline, which we have done across the board, is there a difference in users for a 1 inch versus a 2, 3, and 4, and 5? And there's a trend around the country to go to something called an inclining block structure, which means you, just like we're doing, you're gonna pay more, but under that structure, you pay additionally even more. But you need to know the baseline to where you're starting, and that's what's so critical in this, to get to that solid number. And now that we have it, and the question that was posed earlier, because we have that, and because of what's been done, I don't think there is a need for a peak versus non-peak at all. I think there is the approach that we've taken, I think it can be shown is as valid as the other, and may in fact have some benefits as we move towards how we implement this in terms of a pricing model. So your concerns are very real. They're very real.
And you have to do a better job explaining that
Yeah, I know.
to people than you have to explain it to me. I'm just a Cowboys fan, so I'm down here somewhere.
No, it's for everybody, including us, because the complexity of this is obviously something, even though we've spent hours and hours on it, the average individual just looks at it and goes, why the hell is my bill so big or so
That's
small?
right, that's right.
And you need to get that into a very cogent form, which we will get to, but that in of itself is difficult, getting it synthesized down to that.
That's correct.
So,
And I don't mean to lecture you, because I'm one of the.
No, go right ahead.
If you'll read the first guiding principle of the rate setting manual in the American Water Works Association, you'll see that you make rates that people can understand.
Right.
So you can get ready to explain it, do a good job.
Well,
I
that's
think
why-
you probably can.
That's why you don't want to see this. You want to see a simpler version.
I hope you'll make these public though,
Oh,
so
yeah,
we can
well-
examine them.
Absolutely.
so
I'm
Mike,
sorry
Mike,
that
I would concur that, sorry Sharon, but I think the one rate, I think makes sense, given the methodology that we have baked into that rate, because
Right.
it does take into peak and non-peak
Right.
flow.
But that's only part of the equation.
Right.
And then the rest of it, at the end of it, becomes a pricing model as to how do you want to price your product? In this case, how do we want to price our water? And that's a totally different discussion, but unless you get this worked out, and I mean, this is fabulous, it's laborious, it's mind-numbing, but it's essential in order to make a rational decision based on, okay, now that we know all this, how do we go forward?
Understood.
Okay, so I would say we haven't necessarily got a resolution on that one, but with Mike, you know, we do have what that base, we will be determining what that base is, and then we can decide if we wanna.
Well, what is it gonna take to get to that resolution, though? I mean, I hear Mike saying one rate. Bruce, what do you have?
Well,
I'm
Bruce, you want to go ahead?
I'm in favor of one rate as long as we have a good, solid explanation of how it works the peak into that.
Right.
And I think we all have to be really comfortable with being able to, dare I say, manipulate this spreadsheet so that we change a variable and say, see, here's how it does it. And I think it's that whatever those lines were in the beginning with the total flow and the peak flow, that is that change is that variable. And if that doesn't have a good elevator speech explanation,
Right.
the whole thing is sunk.
Right, agreed.
But to your point.
Trust us, doesn't work.
Yeah.
I'm from the government, I'm here to help.
Yeah, I think that Deb's point is, we've developed a fully absorbed cost model, which means we've thrown everything that we rationally know goes into generating water to serve the public. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what size your meter is, no matter what size your pipe is, it's what it takes to deliver the product. We've done that for sewer, now we're moving into water. Once we've established what all the expenses are related to that and done it in a rational way, which is what's been done, and I think we have concurrence on the validity of that. You know, anyone could look in there and say, well, no, I think that should be 69% instead of 70. That becomes diddly stuff that people can argue about. But the thing is the core there? Does it make sense? Is it rational across the board? And I think that is. The next step is when I use the term about how do you price it now that you're going to deliver the service. That does change a little bit from the standpoint of you need this baseline, but now that you have the baseline, what are you going to do? And I raised in the work that I've done, when you look at other municipalities, other cities, other localities across the board in multiple states, and I've talked to a whole bunch of people that run these things, and you'll see that give or take 50 to 60% around the country use an inclining block structure, which means they have the baseline that we started with here, but then the rate that you pay actually escalates. And sometimes there's 4 or 5 or 6 levels within sewer and within water. And they get fairly complex. But the point is, the more you use, the even more you pay, which isn't necessarily tied to what the base is. And so, in essence, you make money, if you will, on the upper ones. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I make no decision. I'm just saying what's out there. However, there is a perspective, and I think that Jay raised a very good point. Residential users and the 1-inch pipe. We have 1-inch pipes that aren't being used for residential purposes. They're being used for legitimate commercial use. We have licenses that people have filed to run commercial entities, whether it's a rental home or a business that use a 1-inch pipe, but it's a commercial entity. Now this is when you get into pricing, and this is the part that's, for me, quite frankly, been a conundrum as I've looked at it, is if I'm a residential user and I do not rent my property, or I'm a residential user that does not rent my property. I did once, but I don't now. Okay, I don't have a rental license anymore. I'm purely a residential user. I get to deduct absolutely nothing of my water bill, my sewer bill, my taxes, or anything else. I just get to pay. If my house is rented, or I'm a commercial user and I have a commercial license in the city of Rehoboth Beach, which are required by law to have, all those expenses get deducted off my taxes. I can deduct everything. But I'm a resident, I get to deduct nothing. So I'm of the opinion, and it's just that there should be something that if you are a commercial enterprise, you get to pay a little bit more because you have a vehicle by which to recover that which you're paying. I can't do anything. Now, okay, how do you convert that into a reality? Well, if you are allowed to deduct your expenses, if you are a individual taxpayer, that'll translate to some number between 15 and 30-some%. If you're a corporate entity, I don't know what the hell the corporate current tax rate is, but it used to be between 20 and 35%. Now it's whatever it is, 21 or 25%, right off the top. So my argument from a purely pricing perspective is, if you have a commercial license in the city, I don't care what the reason is, you have a commercial license in the city, then you should pay more than a residential user who can't recover a damn thing. And that differential then could be baked into the pricing model, which would then impact ultimately what the revenue is that the city generates. So that residences that do not have a rental license because they are not rented, or on a 1-inch pipe or another size pipe, and those that have commercial licenses, they would pay more, period. If you're purely a resident that does nothing except live here, you pay less.
So, I have a question and then so naiveness, so if I'm a resident that rents my home, I have a commercial license?
Yes,
Okay, so the commercial license combines businesses as well as rentals?
right.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate though for a second.
No, go right ahead, that's why.
So there is also a perception out there that in Rehoboth, we're driving businesses out of town. That we are penalizing businesses for doing business in town and that they can go out of town, start a business, and not have these kind of fees or rules or whatever. So how do we also look at that? I mean, there's no way we're gonna please everyone.
Right.
I think what you said makes a lot of sense to me, but to try and wear different hats, I'm trying to think of what the reaction is on that.
Well, having formerly been in business and run businesses, and that's a valid concern, but I would argue that from the perspective of geographic place and competitive advantage. You're absolutely right. A person right now could locate in Rehoboth Beach or locate out on Route 1. Which is happening. And is that happening because of water and sewer fees, or is it happening for other phenomena that are related within the city? Could it be because the rents have gotten so high that people can't justify being in here?
You got rents, you got you got parking, you got,
Right.
all the rules, whatever, but
Right. Well, let's just say
this is one more
it's
straw.
rents and parking. I think it is a variety of issues, but having said that, you also see, by the same token, you see large hotels that are on the drawing board that have coming before the Planning Commission, and you see a tremendous focus. The property values in Rehoboth continue to climb. They may have stabilized at the moment, but over the last few years, they have gone up rapidly and continue. Whether that rate of improvement or rate of increase is declining a bit, it may be at the current time, projecting on it. But I think that the justification to call out one particular entity of the multiple things that may be contributing to a phenomena, I think would be inappropriate. I mean, the alternative side of that same argument is that year-round residential folks in the city perhaps are being driven out of the city because of all these other changes. And for example, although I'm still here, but if you look at, for example, the sewer rates that we looked at, if we were not who we are, we would not have the sewer infrastructure that we put in. That sewer infrastructure was put in because that 300% or 400% increase that occurs in flow. But that's a reality. That is what it is. We're not Ellendale, even though the state looks at us and says, oh, Ellendale is the same from a year-round residential perspective. We'll treat you the same as Rehoboth Beach. You can't. We're very different. But there is that gigantic flow. Now, it turns out, as residences, individual users, we're absorbing the cost of all that additional capability that Rehoboth really didn't need if it happened to be a small town that happened to be next to the ocean. However, we as residences also benefit from that infrastructure. If we were Ellendale, we wouldn't have the fire department that we have. If we were Ellendale, we wouldn't have the emergency services that we have. If we were Ellendale, we wouldn't have all the support services that we have. The 911 call center wouldn't be here. So there's other benefits, and the commercial enterprises that are here, even though we don't have the same commercial enterprises that we had 20 years ago in town, we have different commercial enterprises. Most of those commercial enterprises, though, aren't really for the residents per se. They're for the visitors. So it ends up being a non-easy answer, but I don't think it can be converted into a we-they versus, it's a tough nut. And I think the argument that you would pose as a challenge to that is very multifaceted and much bigger than just water and sewer. It's a much, much larger issue. And at what point does it reach a breaking point?
Right.
I mean, part of the argument for that has been on the what was going to be the potential increase in terms of taxes from the standpoint of commercial rentals at hotels. That didn't happen. Some think it should, some think it shouldn't, but even if it did, it would still be lower than other places up and down the coast. So I think competitive advantage has to be a very significant part of that, and if there's problems with it in Rehoboth, I think it may have to be settled in other areas that are collectively looked at, not just picking out pieces. That's a long
Yeah.
answer, I
Yeah,
apologize.
I have a hard time kind of wrapping my brain around the fact that, well, because someone has a tax advantage, that as a rate setter, we're gonna try to take that into consideration and, in essence, try to tax them because they have a tax break. So I have a hard time trying to make up for inefficiencies in the tax code with a rate for a water or sewer. I really like focusing on usage, which is what we have. And if we wanted, I would prefer we look at something like
Inclining
the
block?
inclined block,
Okay.
if we have to, rather than try to figure out who has a tax deduction for some of that water usage, and let's figure out what their percentage is and how do we apply that. I would much rather, if we think we have a need to do that, that we look at the inclined block.
That achieves the
Because
same
it's
purposes.
still tied back to usage. And if, you draw it at whatever, 5,000 gallons, all of a sudden you get a different rate for the next 10,000, and then the 10,000 above that is another rate. It doesn't really simplify our billing process, but I think is better than trying to make up for deficiencies in the
Well,
tax code.
and that's perfectly valid. I think that's probably, based on everyone I've talked to and everyone I've seen in terms of talking to other municipalities, I think the implied approach, and since it's roughly about 50% of the country is moving to that, is the inclining block structure. That may in fact be what it tries to do, because with inclining block, even if you're a hotel using 1 million gallons a year, the first 10,000 gallons, you pay that lower rate. But as you keep going up the blocks, your next group keeps paying more and more and more. So everyone gets advantage of the 10,000 gallons that were at some lower rate. But as you get to the higher rate, that next increment, you pick it up. And what the number of blocks are remains to be seen. I would say that I would have to agree with you that implicitly takes that into account. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, just
Yes.
something quick, and I agree with your Kevin, right?
Yes.
That only because there are very few year-round residences in Rehoboth with large households, that those inclining blocks might be less relevant for a beach town. Than I know WSSC, I've recently read they're implementing them in the DC area, because the feeling was, what if you have 8 kids as opposed to just 1 child? It doesn't seem fair. I mean, you're 8 human beings, and you should have the right to use a reasonable amount of water each, rather than the structure before did actually penalize large families. So they, they decided recently, I actually read this, WSSC in DC is going to that block structure. But in Rehoboth, I'm not sure how it's relevant. And I agree also with, I mean, there's a hybrid of a lot of people who do like file Schedule E. They have a condo that they rent out some of the time, but they use it themselves part of the year.
Right.
So I think it would be hard to justify giving lower, to try to charge higher rates to people who have a rental property than those who live here. It would be difficult, but I mean, it could be done, but.
No, but accepting your Kevin, and your argument is the inclining block structure addresses several issues. Whether you have a small family or a large family, you are in control of your water usage. Now, granted, there's a minimum amount of basic water needs, irrespective of the individuals, that you need to live. And once you go above that, now it's discretionary, if you will. If you're in a family, so you say, okay, I'm only going to water my lawn once a week versus every day. That reduces the amount of flow.
And it goes back to what you talked about earlier about conservation.
Conservation.
Are we doing
Right.
anything to incent on conservation?
And the inclining block structure addresses all of that, quite frankly.
But you're right, because there are certain fixed usages, like, if whether you have 8 people in the household or 2, the needs of the lawn will be, identical basically. But no, it's very interesting. I just thought Rehoboth is less in need of these blocks just because you have very few large families living in this city
It's not a
year-round.
question of whether the size of your family, it's a question of the
How much you
water
use.
usage per
Yeah.
unit
Oh,
of
sure.
time
Yeah,
over
yeah.
time. So with inclining blocks, everyone gets to pay, regardless of who you are, the first 10,000 gallons, use that example,
Right.
10,000 gallons. And if you never get above 40,000, you never get above block 2 or 3. If you use 150,000 gallons a month, you may be at the highest block level. and that's,
Right, I mean,
That
from a
gets back
personal
into
point of
issue.
view, I would actually benefit if you were to do these inclined back, because they're relatively low water users. But I'm just looking at it more globally, because of the demographics of this town are a little different than, say, a suburb. So I bet household size here of the year-round residents is extremely small. It might be 1.1 or 1.2, so only because of that. I don't know if you want to factor that in. And it would complicate your life to have, like,
Are
5
you-
different rates.
so are you saying you don't object to the inclining block approach?
I mean, I
or
don't
you-
object to it because, for instance, personally, financially, it would benefit me slightly.
Right, but we have to do it
But
for
I'd say
everybody.
just from a more normative, global point of view for the city of Rehoboth Beach, I'm not sure it's gonna be a big advantage. Because yes, I think usage should drive how much people pay, like the hotels,
That's what
which
this
is,
would do.
That's what that
Right.
does.
This is
Right.
exactly what it would do. So
Right.
if you,
So-
if you hit 10,000 gallons, you pay
less per gallon.
X dollars, right? But now if you're up to 25,000, so you could be a residential that rents, you could have a residential person that has a lot of family that visits them in the summer, and guess what? You gotta pay more because you're using
Right.
more.
Right.
Um,
No, I mean, I don't have a problem with implementing those progressive rates. I think that'd be great for some of us who live here year round. But I'm not sure in the town, given there are mostly low-end users and very high-end users, so I'm not sure. It sounds like a lot of work to implement it for
So just
less
as-
gain than like
Yeah.
areas with a lot of larger households year round.
So just as an example, so Lewis has a incline block, and they charge, $1.76 for the first 4,500. No, I'm sorry, $1.12 for the first 4,500, $1.76 for the second 4,500, and then $2.20 some odd cents for anything above that. Tidewater, another one we get compared to often, they use $8.20 for the first 5,000 gallons, $8.30 for the next 15,000 gallons, and then $8.42 for anything above 20,000 gallons. So that's, kind of what Mike had talked about earlier with the kind of our nearby, the people that we compare to most often.
What opportunity do we have? So let's say, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I feel like we're going down the path of one rate from this table. One rate as far as not doing peak versus non-peak, so one rate,
Right,
okay? But then within that one rate, potentially these incline blocks. So what opportunity is there to potentially say, here, we've got 2 recommendations to go, either to the commissioners or to the city, to the residents, or whomever, to the users, to say, using this, we can see that one rate, it still takes into account flow, and if you use more, you pay more. This other rate still takes into account usage, use more, you pay more, but you pay more than this one, to get feedback, because I think you're gonna hear, I already tell you what you're gonna hear. You're gonna hear from the people that are renters, business owners, that are gonna say the incline blocks penalize me. And why are we doing that? And you're gonna, I almost think like, at least right now, if we go with the one rate, I think we've accomplished the goal of trying to make it fair for people, and we've got it based on usage. Use more, pay more. I think that's an easier discussion with people that doesn't make it quite as hostile, going back to what you said, you versus them, or, you,
well, I
whatever.
think one advantage and that's why I said, I think it's important to do what we've done so far on the sewer and for the water, to establish the core base, that no matter, you can't run, you can't hide, this is a reality that we have in town. I think the next step at some point, and it may very well be to run with this for, if 3 years is the time frame that we look at, and then evaluate as time goes on, because now we're starting from a point of very quantitative data, very explicit data. It's being evaluated more often. This committee may cease to exist, but maybe it needs to reconvene, if you will, or whatever the mayor wants to do, to reestablish and evaluate and look at this on an ongoing basis. And it may be at the end of 3 years, a year before we get to there, we start evaluating again, and is it time for an inclined block?
Is there, yes.
The city may have changed yet again in
Right.
3 years, and there may be good things happening or terrible things happening.
I agree.
And this is part of that analysis.
Maturity,
Tell-
maturity.
Yeah.
Tell me if I'm wrong in my understanding of what this might be. It's the basic structure that we've come up with based on usage.
Yes,
And that returns a certain amount of money to pay the expenses that have been identified. You can take that and just do the straight model we've been doing, or you can put the incline block on top of it. You're still generating the same amount of money, but you're slicing and dicing a little bit differently in terms of who pays how much of that same amount of money.
that is correct.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a fairly simple thing to say, start with the simple one.
I agree.
And you've got this other piece that you can address if it becomes necessary.
And that's,
I agree
And
with
we've
that.
provided all of the recommendations, and then it's up to the elected officials to say, we like your part A, and we like your part B, or we don't like your part B, or we like the two-phase approach.
I mean, I'm comfortable with that, starting with simple. And I think one of our goals initially was also, how can we simplify the process?
The other thing is, this is the first time, at least at this level of involvement, this kind of evaluation and assessment involving so many people, professionals and otherwise, to look at this and looking at everything around the country, amassing a massive amount of research data as to where are we and how we got here and where we need to go, and assessing where we're at. So I think this is a big change for the city in terms of just what's been done to get it to this point, and not, I don't want to say shooting from the hip, because I think that would be inappropriate to say that. And I think a lot of good faith has gone in over the years for people to generate what we have. But it is a changing world at different times, and expenses are changing, investments are changing, and there's a whole series of stuff that has to be addressed. And I think that's been done, and I would agree with Deb. I think that I still have my concerns, but I agree fully with what you just said.
Who's got on that list there, Kevin?
So
I
that
think
was-
we're ticking them off.
that was
Are we
the-
one,
that-
2, 3?
That was the easy one.
Okay. All right.
No, so do we want to stick with, the out-of-town fee being different than the in-town? Out-of-town rate being different than the in-town rate?
I haven't, I'll start off the voting on that.
Well, let me throw one other in. So right now we have 1.5 times for Breezewood. It's my understanding that Breezewood got a lower rate than other out of town because we actually had some land transfer is associated with them because our wells are in their community. 3 of our wells are in the Breezewood community. So there was some that was taken into consideration with whatever rate structure they were given. And then North Shores is at, or everybody else out of town is at 2 times the rate. And is that something we want to continue? And
I think I would say I don't know, and here's the reason why I don't know, why it should be continued as is or needs to be changed. At some point, we need to know whatever the hell the agreements, the concretized agreements that exist somewhere that says, here's what in fact, who's responsible for what. Between the communities involved, I think there's an issue related to the integrity of their system, which is not controlled by Rehoboth Beach, North Shores, and Breezewood. So what is the exposure and the liability that Rehoboth Beach has for 2 areas that are geographically extant the city? I don't know what that is as a resident. I don't know what our exposure is for that, both in the case of North Shore, sewer and water, and in the case of Breezewood, it's just water for Breezewood,
water.
right? So
and it's not just Breezewood, it's a lot of the, businesses
all
up
of the
Route 1,
stuff, okay,
everything kind of other side of Route 1.
right, that's outside the geographic limits of the responsibility of the municipality of Rehoboth Beach. So what was in the past, what was done, and we may have gotten land for our wells in order, as a trade of some form, but now the infrastructure is aging. What happens with that infrastructure at either end, and who's liable for what?
Right, but is the infrastructure, is that included in what we've seen with GHD for the capital outlays? I mean, is that infrastructure included to service those areas?
No.
No.
Oh, it is not.
So,
Okay.
not knowing that, And I think that's significant, at least in the case of North Shores, because on the sewer side, there's some real issues there, and the water side. So in that light, just as we've done a fully absorbed cost model here, I think that has to be taken into account for those two localities, and their water rates may jump up. Now, having said that, the upper limit for their rates, I think, can't be more than other commercial vendors are providing water for. In this case, the one major provider in the region. That sort of sets the high limit of what we could charge, but I don't think it should just be done capriciously. I think it should be based on some amount of analysis like we've done here that says there's a risk here in the infrastructure and there are problems. If there are, here's the identified issues, and we need to incorporate in our capital plan X amount of dollars, just like we've done here, fully costed out. And it says that in the case of Breezewood, your 1.5 becomes 2.2. And in the case of North Shores, your 2 becomes 4, or 2.5, or 3. But that should be based on a rational, reasonable analysis of what the hell the infrastructure is.
Yeah, so it sounds like to do that, we'd have to have knowledge or some insight into the infrastructure, like there need to be some type of assessment done there before we could really come up with
Right.
a full recommendation, which sounds like that's out of the scope of what we need to do immediately. Fair?
It's not within our scope for our charge, which
Well,
was
with this
just
charge.
Rehoboth Beach.
Right.
But I think it's something that should be
But-
done.
But I think for the exercise for what you need to answer, I think what I would like to see is, and I don't know if Matt can do this, but can we look at, for North Shores, is there a way to kind of slice like we've done with account users here? Is there a way to look at North Shores and Breezewood and whomever, or just those jurisdictions to say, if we plop in this methodology that we've done for Rehoboth, plop it into the existing rate structure, the 2 times the 1.5, what impact is that gonna have on those users? And is that something that is rational at this point, not knowing what the infrastructure needs are?
So I think, I'll ask Matt, is that something we could do? We can filter out all of the out-of-town residents and all of the 1.5 Breezewood kind of residents, and build that into the workbook, that if we said, so we could have a variable for each of those and change it from 1.5 to 1.8, and to see what those various changes in rates would do across the board, how they would impact everything else.
Yeah.
So
I think we can do that.
you have
so
the
basically, we're doing calculations here for just Rehoboth users. We would basically duplicate that and have a similar setup for the other groups of users and have separate calculations for them as well.
So then we could try various options on, is two times the right number, kind of deal, or is 1.5 the right
I mean,
number?
and how long has this structure been in place, the 2 times and the 1.5?
Really good questions. I don't personally know.
Has anyone assessed it in the last 10, 20 years, or?
It's probably been, yeah,
Yeah.
So,
long
yeah.
time.
Long enough ago.
30,
that nobody
25,
can put
30
their hands
years.
on
Yeah,
exactly
right.
what the document is.
Walter doesn't
So it needs to
remember.
be assessed.
And I get,
Always been that way.
Always been that way?
It's always been that way.
When did North Shores come online, do you know?
I have no idea, but there was, I don't know if it's legal, but there was a premise, not being argumentative. But that when we did Breezewell, it was turned over to us in exchange for the rate. And when you go to North Shores, if they need a repair, it's in the rate.
Right.
I don't think there's any change in that, that there was some logic put to it.
Okay.
But I don't know that there was a contract written.
Okay.
And if it's available and if it's logical today.
Okay.
and I got 2 quick questions on things you were saying.
Sure.
Or maybe it was you were saying. The market for the other rate, kind of that other people are dealing with, is Tidewater?
Tidewater is one, Lewis obviously is another.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it almost sounded like you were saying something that I don't think you were saying, so I think I misinterpreted it. When you were talking about Breezewood, you mentioned businesses along Route 1. Is the area that's covered by Breezewood just the residential, or is it also that commercial?
It's my understanding, and I'd have to confirm, Breezewood is Breezewood.
Is
And,
that
and the
development?
stuff, the commercial stuff on Route 1 is out of town,
Okay, not part of Breezewood.
not part of Breezewood. So they get the 2.0, not the
Okay,
1.5.
okay, okay.
I think it's just the community of Breezewood itself. gets the
That's
1.5.
what I thought, and then I thought you were
Right.
going somewhere else.
No, that's my understanding, but, the whole idea of any written agreements would be a great thing to.
So,
right.
in theory, way back when, the whole premise behind doing the 2 times and the 1.5 was to build up some surplus, if you will, maybe bad use of terms, but with the intention that if the infrastructure needed to be cared for in those areas, it was part of the cost factored into the 2 times.
I don't know that. My guess would be it was
nobody-
done in an effort to keep the residential rates lower.
Yeah, okay.
Right? That'd be my guess,
Yeah.
You can't give somebody out of town because they're not paying property taxes to us. None of their other payments really come into us.
But as Walter
so-
pointed out, it was forever, and there was an exchange, but it's been 30 years, so it's,
Yeah.
Along the transmission path, we encountered on the other side from Breezewood Wells, Cone and Depression. When you ran the well, we took other people's water away from them. So selectively, in certain places, we took people along the transmission line. And I don't know how we fare as regulated or not by the Public Service Commission, but you have, somewhere there's a statement that we cannot charge in a normal rate that will throw us into a question of what we can do to keep other people out. We have first option, I still believe, just a requirement to serve anybody along the transmission line unless they go through some appeal to be accepted, just like you do for wells for irrigation systems and stuff like that. But there is a path that you can go through and not get water from Rehoboth. But in most cases, it's inherently thought of as the water supply in between the city of Rehoboth will supply. Is that your agreement, Mr. Johnson?
That's as I understand it, yes.
All right, what's the next bullet you got there?
Yeah.
What was the decision on that?
Well, the decision on that is we asked.
10 minutes.
Yeah, right, let's get stuff done, baby. So we've asked Matt to take a look at the Breezewood and the outside
To see if we can incorporate
users to
that
see if we can,
template in there.
yeah.
Are we liking the 4-year period, or let me back up? Do we want to try to focus on the same period that we do with the sewer
Yes.
rate? So whatever our rate period is going to
Yes.
be, it's going to be.
Yeah.
So we
I
can,
think,
Should
I
be-
think stability is
Should be
important.
the same.
Yes.
should be the same. And right now, our recommendation on the sewer side is the 4-year piece that takes a
And-
little bit out of
And do
the
we need
bite.
to kind of go over that pickup with the 4-year rate and the 3-year rate, where the change in how we use the surplus?
Let's save that till we get back to the kind of how we're going to present the sewer, because that plays into that. And it's, yeah. Do we need, yes, I think we do. Do we need
Read us.
do we need operational and capital reserves for the water side of the business like we said we do for the sewer side of the business?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, that's a softball, yes.
And I would throw out, after having done just a wee bit of research, on sewer side, we said 300,000 and 300,000. So we'd factor that into the rate schedule. I think it'd be in the order of 100,000 on the water side, just because it's not nearly as old. It's not going to fail us like we think the sewer may. Yeah, absolutely.
I just-
knock on wood. But I think our risks are a little lower on the water side. So to me, that seemed like a reasonable number, but I'm certainly open to any other suggestions that we
I
might
don't
have.
have anything else to go off of.
And just let me clarify something else that was, I think, brought up, but I'm not quite sure I understood the answer. The infrastructure for these other out-of-town users is the city's responsibility?
We fix it if it
Both.
breaks, yeah.
Both the transmission to get there and whatever the public body is responsible for in
So
terms of
North
main
Shore
or
is,
whatever there
yeah,
is.
it's my understanding, our water distribution system, we fix if it breaks, and their collection system, we fix if it breaks. So does that in essence make it our systems, with an easement on their land? Not quite sure, but that's kind of the philosophy that's that we use right now, is if it breaks, we fix it.
But that raises an interesting issue. It's, the conceptual framework, if you fix it, if it breaks, we fix it, usually implies it's something minor, if you will. But what happens if they have a catastrophic failure and a major line has to be replaced and it's now into the millions? That's something, if there isn't a contract and it doesn't exist, that's, I think,
It needs to be resolved.
needs to be resolved to get some identification, because otherwise that means the residents of Rehoboth Beach are on the hook for all that.
Right, and I don't know, I said earlier that it was not accounted for in their asset management plan. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I need to circle back and just
Yeah,
confirm
so we
that's the
can
case.
take
So I
that,
don't know
I
that-
think we need to take that as a parking lot thing, that's again,
Yeah.
outside of kind of this
Right.
scope, but probably a good aha for someone to look into and make sure that it is cared for.
Because under that scenario you bring up,
I'm sorry.
100,000 is
Minimal,
nothing.
right.
Peanuts.
The keeper of some of the information for North Shores is right down at Dan Anderson's place at, 4th Street or 5th Street. They have fantastic records, North Shores Association and Dan Anderson's records when Anderson set that up. And Sam will also know that also, and maybe John Hughes.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, I've ticked off all the items on my list, so.
Good.
As opposed to all the people.
Can we adjourn now? Okay,
Yeah.
so we have,
Now, we have a meeting Thursday,
Thursday,
1 to 3 again.
yeah, Matt, can you crank some of these updates in time for Thursday?
I will do my best, man.
Okay. Okay.
Well done.
Anything else from the audience? All right, hearing none, anything else from the folks at the table?
No,
All righty, great, thanks, everybody, yeah.
Thank you.
Big step forward on water today, so thanks, thanks, Matt.
yep, thanks, Matt.
All right, you're welcome, guys.
that's definitely better than 6.5-hour meetings.
And you thought it was gonna be easy, you thought water was easy.
You said that.
No, you jinxed us.
So Thursday, I might be late. I got a client meeting at like 11:30. I don't know if I'll be done.
I think Bert is,
Take care.
well, we're four either way, so.
Sure, trying.
You okay if I come in late?
Figure that.
Okay.
Can you see continue?
So I can heckle you?
You can watch us on TV while you're at your client meeting.
Yeah, I don't think they're gonna appreciate that. So, yeah, we came back this week. Came back Wednesday, last week.
Okay,
Yeah, so, had a great time.
good. You always go for a month?
No, this is the first time I've ever done that.
Oh, okay.
So, it's the fastest month I think I ever experienced.